What's up, everybody? Welcome to GoJo with Mike Golic Jr. That's me. With me, as always, producer Brandon Newman. Brandon, not the normal show today for the main reason of what we saw on Monday Night Football last night. Jarring, emotional, where we took the night and got up this morning to record this podcast so we'd have as much information as possible to give to people, to try and pass along about what happened with Damar Hamlin, second-year player out of Pitt for the Buffalo Bills last night in Monday Night Football, and what went on there. Full transparency, we recorded an interview with Parker Fleming from the Purple Theory podcast to talk about TCU football and stuff. That's still going to be on this podcast, but that was recorded before everything happened with Damar Hamlin. And so, obviously not anything anyone's got to listen to before they're ready to, or at all if you don't want to. It's a podcast. We'll timestamp it. We'll put it at the end of this. You're going to hear us on there, laugh and talk and act normally in a way that probably wouldn't have been the case had it been recorded before. And so that'll be there, that'll be separate, and if it's not for you right now, that's totally fine, but just didn't want anyone to be unprepared for that popping up at the end of this. It was recorded before. Parker didn't know, I didn't know at that point, and so that was what we were operating on then. And Brandon, that's kind of the situation now. So for just to give all the information before we kind of decompress some and look at how everyone's feeling around this situation. Here is what we know happened last night during Monday Night Football in the first quarter. Buffalo Bills safety Damar Hamlin had his heartbeat restored on the field after suffering cardiac arrest during the team's Monday night game against the Bengals and is currently in critical condition at a Cincinnati hospital, the Bills said in a statement early this morning. Hamlin was administered CPR on the field for multiple minutes after he collapsed after tackle against the Bengals wide receiver T. Higgins. Hamlin received oxygen, according to the ESPN broadcast, and was placed in an ambulance and taken off the field about 16 minutes after he collapsed during that game. Timeline-wise, this is essentially how it went. The injury occurred at 8:55 Eastern. At 9:18 Eastern, the game was temporarily suspended. At 9:25, an ambulance left the stadium, and at 10:01, the game was initially postponed. And so, first and foremost, Brandon, we offer up our thoughts and prayers like everybody else. I think seeing the unification of support in the aftermath of something this traumatic was like the one encouraging thing in all of this, to see so many people wrap their arms and wrap their love around Damar Hamlin, his family, his Buffalo Bills family, and really everyone you saw on that field last night dealing with one of the worst things any of them had ever seen. And I think that's kind of the image that struck so many of us and sticks with so many of us, is the immediate reaction and the look on the faces of his teammates and the coaches, who very quickly realized this wasn't some normal football injury. This wasn't something that they were used to. This was something far, far worse. And the gravity of that situation really, it struck everyone, struck me. Like, how are you feeling? How are you doing? Because that was a lot for those players and coaches and that family to process, but it was also something that everyone watching in on that, certainly also a jarring experience.
Yeah, it's becoming a jarring experience for a lot of us and traumatic for a lot of us, but it is still just solely and specifically about Damar Hamlin and him and his family and him getting back to some sense of normalcy after this. But yes, Mike, it was hard to see every football player's nightmare. I think we talk a lot about the mindset you have to go out there and do what you do and do what players do, especially at the elite level of the NFL players. And a defender goes out there and makes the play that he's supposed to make, hops up, and then collapses immediately afterwards. Like that's terrifying for you to make the right play just as you were supposed to make it, textbook in all the different ways, and for you that to be possibly his last play ever is terrifying. It's scary. It's made me kind of rejigger how I think about football and the game and the importance around it. But like you said, Mike, it was great to see these men and decision makers around the game make a human decision
Yeah.
when forced to.
Yeah, and that was one of the things, the timeline of this, because there was a lot of questions about the way the league handled this, and I think we're still going to be waiting for information on how that went down. We saw during the game, Zach Taylor, the head coach of the Bengals, and Sean McDermott, the head coach of the Bills, went over to each other on the field. There was a conversation there. There was a conversation amongst the teams before they ultimately went back into the locker rooms, and that was where, right now, based on what was talked about during the broadcast and what was reported, we think the coaches got on the phone with the league office and started having those conversations. I was glad that the ultimate decisions and the conversations had by the men, especially on those teams who just had to watch that happen to their brother, like someone they love, someone they see every day, especially the Bills players, and for guys on the Bengals who witnessed that as well. There was a ton of emotion, but I'm glad they got to do that part behind closed doors, because we already had to see so much of their reaction and their immediate grief on display, because they were on the field when it happened. That, it I think took everyone a minute to adjust to the fact on the field, because you mentioned it, you're wired to tolerate so much when it comes to the carnage of football by being a player at this level. Like, you and I didn't play in the NFL, we played high level college football, but you see a lot, right? Like, I think of all the things that you see on the field. Like, we've seen friends go down with injuries and get carted off. We've seen friends and games ended on jarring concussions where you have guys completely knocked out, and you see the severity, like seared into my brain, the end of the Notre Dame Washington game when we were there. Yeah. And the game ended on a crunching hit. Two of our safeties hit a Washington player in the end zone. And as soon as he went down, Kyle McCarthy, our captain, was just waving the trainers over and the medical staff owner, because he knew that guy was knocked out and knew he needed medical attention right now. Yeah. And we've seen guys get their entire leg turned around, breaking their leg, and you flip the drill and you move it 10 yards and you hear Riverside and you keep going, and it feels callous, because in some ways it is, but that's just, again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm saying it's the reality of the situation. Is that's the stuff that we all just kind of got used to as part of the sport. Like, when I was a little kid, my dad had the conversation with me and said, obviously, if you want to play this game, it's your choice. If you play the game as long as you say you want to, knowing what my goals were at the time, if you play the game as long as you want to, you're not going to come out whole on the other side. Like, there's a reality of the physical toll that my dad was straight up with me from the beginning. And I've seen it with him and how the sports affected his body, the surgeries and the things that he's needed as an older person. But those are still within the bounds of what we have kind of accepted as the carnage in this game that we can tolerate. And so it took a while, I think, for everyone on the field to sort of stop and realize, oh, we're not just going to have the cart go off the field or an ambulance go off the field, which has happened before, and people have continued play. That's the wild reality of this game. And I think it took everyone. Yeah, that is the norm. But chest compressions on the field is not the norm. And all the things that we talked about here, you could see very quickly shook everyone out of that. And so seeing the players and the coaches take that beat and then go back into the locker room and start to really process what was going to happen next with this game, I can't imagine what it was like for those guys going through that moment on the field, having that all play out in front of people in the way that it did.
I mean, that was probably one of the things that illustrated how this was not the same, was the reaction from the players, how soon they gathered around, how concerned the Bengals were, as well as the Bills, who were in earshot or eye shot of Damar Hamlin. Mike, and we always talk about this new media time, but I do want to take the time to thank Ryan Clark as somebody, in one of the first former players in this media game of the new media that we see now, Mike. But everything he said last night with Scott Van Pelt needed to be said. The jargon that gets used when it comes to the love of the game. I'll die for this. Like I'm a soldier. I'll die, or rather go out on the battlefield. Like all these words that, what is it? Describe death, but they're just trying to displace like
You're trying to show how,
dedication
yeah, you're trying to
and
show how
commitment.
much it means to you.
Right, exactly, and this is one of those instances that makes you think about that. And as someone as a former player and as someone who's, I'll be honest, like has aspirations to be a fan in that way of my own children playing in the game. Like it's jarring for everyone. But something else that Ryan Clark said that I think is worth repeating is that let's not forget that Damar Hamlin was a 24-year-old living out his dream. Like he was exactly where he wanted to be last night in that moment, making a play, biggest stage, biggest game, the game that had implications for playoff seeding and all these things that seem so antiquated and small in comparison. But this individual human, this man, this 24-year-old who's at the peak of his abilities, is in critical condition right now, and that alone is scary. It's terrifying. It's paralyzing. But we just really do hope and pray that this is a success story. And I don't know if it's, I don't know why I need it to be. I desperately just need him to be okay.
Yeah, we all want to see him get to be okay because to your point, he's a incredibly healthy, incredibly fit 24-year-old, and this kind of stuff does not happen normally to people like that. At least not in our minds. Like you're indestructible at that point. You're indestructible, and for the players on that team, for everyone involved, they know him as more than just a player. Mm-hmm. They know his mom, who we talked about being with him in the ambulance going over to the hospital on the broadcast last night, and they know the things he's done in the community, his goals and aspirations. Like they know him the way we all know a lot of our teammates, which is better than almost anyone else because of the time and effort that you put into all those goals that you talked about there. And so I'm sure bleeding for their brother. We saw Stephon Diggs after pleading with police officers and personnel outside the hospital to let him in to see his friend. Like that's how deeply this hurts all them. But I'm sure, and I think it's because it's an unavoidable part of being human and doing the same thing that he does, where I'm sure a lot of them also looked and said, that's not supposed to be able to happen to us. And if it can happen to him, what's to stop it from happening to me? And now all of a sudden, when that shell that you put on, because you got to put on physical armor, certainly build up your body to play this sport, but there's got to be a lot of mental armor of walking onto that field. Yes. And I remember an offensive line coach of mine saying, the mentality is 10 foot tall and bulletproof. That's how you got to approach every play. And because if you don't have that mentality, you're playing slower and you're putting yourself at risk for injury in the way that we all know is possible. And so you sort of find a way to compartmentalize and block out all these terrible things that can be possible, all the stuff that we describe that's normal run of form for football, and you don't even entertain, you don't have the ability to comprehend something like this. And so that's why I think you saw these guys rattled to their core, was obviously the first and foremost the thought of their friend, where we're all at, but also just seeing mortality on the football field is not something that we're conditioned to really be able to process or understand in that setting. And so, process-wise, the NFL also had a call last night. League officials were on a call talking about some of the parts of this process, because there was this notion of a 5-minute warm-up resumed to play that got discussed during the broadcast and got discussed by some people after. And NFL Executive Vice President Troy Vincent was on this call. He's also a former player. And his full statement on this said, quote, "I'm not sure where that came from. Frankly, there was no time period for the players to get warmed up. Frankly, the only thing we asked was that referee Sean Smith communicate with both coaches to make sure they had the proper time inside the locker room to discuss what they felt was best. So I'm not sure where that came from. 5-minute warm-ups never crossed my mind personally, and I was the one, and I'm not saying this to be selfish, but the one that was communicating with the commissioner. We never, frankly, it never crossed our minds to warm up to resume play. That's ridiculous. That's insensitive. And that's not a place that we should ever be in." And so that's not a discussion I really am interested in having right now. The NFL has certainly not earned the trust of the public when it comes to how they deal with the bodies of players. I think that's always going to be a tough notion for some people, and it's well-earned skepticism by a lot of people. But because of how outside of the norm this case is, we're thankful that the medical people responding had a plan, that those people were quick to act and quick to get him the help that he needed. But for everyone else, operations-wise around this, maybe there should be a plan. I'm not an expert on game day operations, and maybe there should be a more concrete plan for when something goes horrifically wrong in the middle of the game for how you're going to respond for everything around the moment, knowing that the medical personnel, all those people that are trained for that, are going to respond in the way that can make sure the life gets saved in the middle of all this. But again, that seems secondary and largely unimportant, but that was what the NFL said about that particular notion that had been put out there. And they've really, and the last update on that, and this is from Jonathan Jones over at the NFL on CBS, said the NFL wanted the focus of the call to be on Damar Hamlin and not the game. There's no update of if and when the Bills-Bengals game will be rescheduled. According to the NFL rulebook, full authority rests with Roger Goodell in an emergency situation like this. And so I think, again, rightly, all focus is going to stay on Damar Hamlin right now. And so hopefully when you listen to this podcast, there's already the good news update that we're all hoping for here. Hopefully Damar Hamlin and his family and his football family all get a chance to see and hear from their brother, or at the very least hear and know that he is going to be okay in this process. And after this process, Brandon, because this was a legitimate traumatic experience, and hopefully everyone involved is given the resources to go out and try and process that as best you can. I mean, the only thing that is even remotely similar in being a traumatic experience that I know you and I went through was the passing of Declan Sullivan at our football practice our senior year. One of our video operators, unfortunately, in a tragic accident, lost his life during our practice. And in the chaos surrounding that, Brandon, it's something that still registers a lot today. And it's because that was that was just legitimate trauma. We saw someone die that day, and how you go about processing that after is certainly unique to everybody, but it's
exactly.
just to underscore that this is different than the norm for all the reasons that we've said. And so I hope these guys are given the resources and given the time to contemplate and digest and try and reconcile with this in whatever way they need to, grieve this in whatever way they need to, because it's insane to even think about now. But at some point in theory, these guys are going to continue to play football this season. And I don't know how that happens. I've never been in their shoes with something like this specifically that happened on the field in the way that it did for them. And so,
you would think they would need some type of concrete answers to move differently or safely. And unfortunately, when these things happen, there's always that finger that gets pointed to the victim when it comes to the immortality of these things. And it's like, okay, them, not me. But I don't see a way. Obviously, you just have to move forward. That's what we're doing right now. This is the second time we tried to move forward with this conversation. So I think it's going to take some time for plenty of people, and it's all individual. But I feel for everyone. I feel for the football family. I feel for everyone who was watching Monday Night Football on ABC last night. Like, this is a lot of eyes got a chance to see this horrific, traumatic incident. So there's a lot of people that need help on the back end.
Yep. A lot of people saw the risk that is ever present when you step on the field to play this sport, and That is a staggering reality to this situation. But the reality right now is, again, centered on Damar Hamlin, and that's where it should be. So love and light to him and his family, man. Whatever you believe in, I'm not someone who prays often, but I promise you, I'll pray in this case if it'll help even a little bit. If there's anything that you believe in that you do it in the name of Damar Hamlin today, and hope that young man gets good news soon, and we get good news about him soon that we can all report here, and this can be, a horrific part of the journey and not the end of the journey here for the young man that by all accounts, and we've seen so many stories pouring in about his efforts off the field, him as a person and a teammate, seems like an exemplary young man. And so hopefully he gets the chance to continue all of those things outside of football that are far more important in his life and for everyone around him right now.